Amen. Okay. Well, we are considering tonight strictly the northern kingdom of Israel. And again, those kings are listed on the left-hand side of our chart. Just to kind of go through what we've looked at, we're dealing with, as far as Israel's lasting as a kingdom, about 200 years. Solomon dies in 931 BC, and Samaria is going to be destroyed in roughly 722 BC. And really, as far as how we think about that northern kingdom, we certainly know about Jeroboam and the idolatry that he introduced into the northern kingdom. Then we think of Ahab and his family. And then we think of perhaps Jehu and the dynasty of Jehu. And that's where we've been spending our time as far as these northern kings are considered. And Jehu, who was tasked with eliminating the family of Ahab and also eradicating Baal, in which he did faithfully. And so because of that, how many of his descendants was he told were going to reign on the throne? 4. Yes, 4. Okay. So we have looked at the reigns of 3 of those descendants, beginning with Jehoahaz, then Jehoash, and then Jeroboam II. Now, what did we say about Israel during the reign of Jeroboam II? How were things going in the kingdom, at least from a physical standpoint? Right, so this is really the height of power as far as the Israelite kingdom is concerned. But let's also remember there's a little bit of a power vacuum that's going on in the ancient Near East at this time, as Syria or Aram, their neighbor immediately to the north, has been severely weakened, and then Assyria, the rising power, dominant power in the region, had also been weakened. So Israel, even though they've not been faithful to the Lord, they've not been following in His ways, and yet they're able to, at this time, expand the borders of their kingdom. But following the death of Jeroboam II, and you can see what we think are the dates of these various reigns, he dies in 753. Again, the kingdom ends in 722. So we're looking at 30 years of really just a lot of turmoil going on in the kingdom of Israel. So we're going to spend just a little bit of time just giving even a brief synopsis of what happens. And then we're going to look at some factors that led to the rapid decline in Israel. So starting with Zechariah. Zechariah is the last of those 4 of Jehu's dynasty. And he reigns 6 months. Is that right? Is it 6 months or 2 months? 6 months, that's right, I thought so. And does he die of natural causes? No. He is killed. This is an assassination. This is a coup. And so Shallum, and we're not told a whole lot about Shallum, but Shallum comes to the throne. How long is Shallum going to reign? 1 month. In fact, Shallum's reign is so short that we're not even given anything as far as was he good or evil. We pretty much know he's evil, but nothing is even said about that. Well, Shallum did not have a natural cessation of his life either. He is assassinated by Menahem. And Menahem is going to rule for 10 years. And so he comes, it would seem at least, to I don't know if you'd say peaceful end, but he dies while still being king, and then the throne goes to his son Pekahiah, but for only 2 years, at which point he is assassinated. And he is assassinated by an army commander. We're going to talk a little bit more about him, Pekah, who is credited with a 20-year reign, but if you'll go ahead and notice those dates that are listed for his reign, got some interesting things happening there. His reign is said to begin when Menahem's reign began. So we'll talk about that here in just a little bit. And then Pekah also is assassinated, and the last king of Israel, Hoshea. So we have 6 kings, 5 different dynasties, and political assassinations galore. all in a very short time frame. So let's look at why all this devolves so quickly. And the chief factor is this. What it says of Zechariah in chapter 15 and verse 9. He did evil in the sight of the Lord as his fathers had done. He did not depart from the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, which he made Israel sin. The only king that this or something very similar to this is not said about in this chapter is Shallum. And again, he only reigned a month. So there's no commentary given on his reign. But it says that of Menahem in verse 18. It says that of Pekahiah in verse 24. And it says that of Pekah in verse 28. And so in this short chapter, looking at all these different kings over and over again, this idea that here's the problem. And I want to just pause here for a second and think about this. When Jeroboam originally institutes this false worship at Dan and Bethel, what was Jeroboam's aim? Was his aim to just completely leave Jehovah God and to completely leave all of the commandments of God? Was that Jeroboam's aim? What was his aim? Yeah. Rehoboam, the rightful king, if you're thinking about the Davidic line, is still reigning in Jerusalem. And what else is in Jerusalem? Well, the temple is in Jerusalem. And Jeroboam's thinking was, okay, if the people go from Israel down to Judah, down to Jerusalem, to worship God there, their hearts are going to return back to the line of David. So I'm just going to install a couple of places of worship. Not that we're not going to worship Jehovah God. We're just going to worship Jehovah God in some different ways. And so he makes the two golden calves. One, again, at the border between Israel and Judah at Bethel. One in the far north at Dan. He opens up the high priesthood and the priesthood in general, maybe looking back to that time when Aaron had constructed the golden calf and when Moses asked, "Who is with me?" and only the Levites were with Moses. And so maybe that's the reason why Jeroboam said, well, I'm not going to have the Levites as priests, so he makes other people's priests. And he changes some of the feast days. But other than that, it would seem like, all right, we're still following Jehovah. We're going to honor him. We're going to keep his laws. What happens when we start viewing the will of God as I can take it piecemeal. I can take parts that I like and accept, and then I can change the rest. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead, Steve. Yeah. And so I go back to, Jeroboam as he institutes all these changes. If Jeroboam could see 200 years in the future and see what's happening to Israel, would he want to do this? Has he imagined all the political turmoil that's going to happen because of his unfaithfulness to God? Has he imagined all the oppression of the people that's going to happen when a few select wealthy grow in the kingdom and then they then oppress their poorer neighbor? Has he imagined that? Has he imagined what will happen with the introduction of Baal under Ahab? I don't think Jeroboam is thinking that all these things are going to happen, but all these things happen, and I think the text is pointing us to all the sins that are happening in Israel, which we don't even know what they are, yet it goes back to this original sin of Israel. They departed from the ways of God. And when you start departing from the ways of God, you don't know where, well, I take that back, you do know where it's going to wind up. Full-blown departure. Abandoning God, and then ultimately, as we're even going to see tonight, God abandoning you. One other particular note is given as far as some of the evil, and that's in the reign of Menahem. It talks about in verse 14, he goes up against a city, and Menahem is from Tirzah, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. But when he becomes king, he goes up against a city in Judah, Tipsah. Yeah, something like that. You know, I really should try to find out how these names are pronounced before class. I always think of that as I'm standing up to teach class. But since you don't know how they're pronounced either, there we are, Tipsah. Probably not it. But he goes up against this city. And what I try to draw your attention to in the materials, remember all the way back when the kingdom originally divided, what did Rehoboam want to do at the start? Rehoboam's going to invade. Rehoboam's gathered his army, and Rehoboam is going to invade Israel and take Israel back by force. Why does Rehoboam not do that? God, through his prophet, says, don't go up against your kinsmen. You're not supposed to war with your kinsmen. And God had been the one who had split the kingdom. He had been the one who had given the kingdom to Jeroboam. And we've seen, over time that whole notion of not warring against your brethren, not warring against the fellow tribes of Israel has kind of gone by the wayside. But Menahem even takes it a step further. It says he goes and he strikes Tipsah in verse 15. And because he did not open to him, therefore he struck it and ripped up all its women who were with child. So he's not simply going on conquest here. He is afflicting just terrible atrocities on even those who were innocent, non-combatants in Judah at this time. So that, again, kind of lets us know here's the level of evil that has creeped in among God's people at this time. Any other thoughts or comments or questions before we move on? Okay. Staying here, there also appears to be some geographic and regional rivalries. And if you'll recall, going back to the very beginning of the kingdom splitting, regional differences played a role in that. Who recalls, why is it that Judah was so willing to stay with Solomon's family, stay with Rehoboam? One, which tribe is Rehoboam from? From Judah. And recall when we talked about Solomon and how he had divided Israel into 12 regions, and each of those regions was supposed to provide for Solomon's table and for his kingdom 1 month out of the year. What tribe was conveniently excluded from that? Judah. And so there have been regional differences going way back, and you go back to the time of the judges. Ephraim in particular had always kind of had his nose up in the air, and so when various judges go to war, and if Ephraim's not called when they think they should be called to battle, then Ephraim gets upset about that. So there's these ideas of there being regional and tribal differences, and maybe that's coming into play here too, because it mentions specifically that Menahem is from the city of Tirzah. Does anybody remember where Tirzah has come into play earlier in the divided kingdom? That was capital of Jeroboam. Not his original capital, but his final capital. And so it may be that when Menahem goes and kills Shallum, who had killed, of course, Zechariah before him, and again, the text makes sure we know this is where he's from. Maybe this is out of loyalty to what Menahem thinks was the original line of Israel and what is the rightful line of Israel. Not saying that Menahem was in any way related to Jeroboam, but kind of that idea of we're bringing the kingdom back to whom it belongs. We're bringing it back to Jeroboam's people. We're bringing it back to the idea of even where he had ruled. But then there's also this, and we made mention of Pekah and the fact that his dates just don't match up. And Scripture says that he reigned for 20 years. Now we've seen this with the kings of Judah in particular, that there appears to be a lot of co-regency. And so even Sunday we're going to talk about the reigns of Jotham and Ahaz. Well, Jotham began his reign before Uzziah died. Do you might remember why he would need to do that? What happened to Uzziah at the conclusion of his reign? Yeah, he got leprosy. He tried to force his way into the temple to burn incense. So really for the last 10 years of Uzziah's reign, he has leprosy. So Jotham is going to be reigning with him, and then even Ahaz will reign at the same time as Jotham does, and same thing with Hezekiah. Well, Pekah, though, is not related to Pekahiah or Menahem. What is thought is Pekah is kind of having a rival kingdom. In particular, it talks about when Pekah assassinates Pekahiah that he brings men from Gilead. Gilead is on the eastern side of the Jordan River, Transjordan as it's sometimes referred to. So the idea is that, well, Menahem became king. He took the kingdom by assassinating Shallum. There may have been a rival kingdom at the same time on the other side of the Jordan River. And Pekah is reigning over there, and when he comes to a point where he can, then he exerts his influence and his power on the western side of the Jordan River and assassinates Pekahiah and then assumes command or rule over all of the kingdom. We don't know that from Scripture, but that is what seems to be a good fit, and it fits the idea of him reigning 20 years. Otherwise, we have a pretty hard time figuring out how do we fit a 20-year reign into his kingdom. But just to say, we've got, again, tribal differences, regional differences. At one point, we may even have had two different kingdoms. But this is the big one. This is a relief of Tiglath-Pileser III, or Pileser III. He is found two times in our text. The first time in verse 19, or Pul, king of Assyria, and then in verse 29, he is referred to as the name he is known in history as Tiglath-Pileser, again, how you want to pronounce this up to you. We've talked about Assyria a few times. Assyria had come to great prominence during the reign of Ahab. And so Ahab and even the Syrians had allied at one point to battle against the Assyrians. And then in the time of Jehu, again, Assyria comes to prominence. And so Shalmaneser III lists Jehu as bringing tribute to him. But then there have been periods of weakness. And during those periods of weakness, Aram had exerted its power and brought Israel pretty low. But then another ruler of Assyria would come and Israel would have relief from the Arameans. Well, when Tiglath-Pileser comes to power, he's got a few issues, and kind of go to a map of his empire. Babylon had been a thorn in Assyria's side for some time. There would be times when Babylon would be submissive, but then, if Assyria had a weak moment, Babylon would try to rebel. Well, when Tiglath-Pileser comes to the throne, Babylon is in another period of rebellion, so he has to put that down. Then there's another empire to the north of him, the Urartu, up here. They have grown in significant power, and they have extended their empire. And so Tiglath-Pileser has to kind of put that to rest and kind of check their power, make sure they're not going to be having any incursions down south into his territory. So he more or less defeats their major armies. He does not fully conquer that empire, but they're no longer a threat. So you look at the map, he's got the south and the east kind of contained. Babylon's under control. He's got the north taken care of. And so where do these empires from Mesopotamia, where do they often turn? Now they start looking at what the Romans would refer to as Palestine, that Fertile Crescent area going down toward Egypt. And recall again that big area right there in the middle, that's all desert. So this is the area where these empires look. Well, and that's exactly what he does. Now, there were different ways in which these Assyrian kings would approach smaller nations. If a nation with a king voluntarily paid tribute, then the Assyrians would most likely just kind of let them be. You swear your fealty to me, the Assyrian emperor, the Assyrian king, you're going to be okay. But if then that kingdom rebelled or thought about rebelling or didn't send the tribute in, that took us to the next level. And so the Assyrians would invade. They may very well take away the nobility. They would depose the current ruler. They would set up a ruler who was pro-Assyrian, and they'd make sure you continue to pay the tribute. So now this is what's called a vassal state. This is not an independent kingdom. This is a vassal of Assyria, and if you don't do what the Assyrians want, there's going to be trouble. Well, if that vassal kingdom then rebels or withholds their tribute, what's the final step that the Assyrians would take?
They would take them over, they would take all the inhabitants and displace them somewhere else and bring a different nation in.
Yeah. Assyria is credited with one of the greatest movements of human beings in history because of their method of when you came to one of these kingdoms that's in rebellion, not submitting to Assyria, they would almost fully remove the inhabitants and transport them to another place and then refill that area with transplants from other conquered areas. They are exterminating the national identity of that land. Israel is going to go through all three steps. The first step is in the days of Menahem. And so go back to verse 19 of chapter 15. When it says, Pul, king of Assyria, came against the land, and Menahem gave Pul 1,000 talents of silver so that his hand might be with him to strengthen the kingdom under his rule. And it goes on to talk about how Menahem did this. He exacted, basically taxed his own people, even his most loyal people, the people of wealth, that they all had to get 50 shekels of silver. So he got this tribute money and he gives it to the Assyrian king. And the Assyrian king's fine with that. You've proven, okay, the Assyrians have been on the march. They're dealing with Syria and other places, but here's Israel, and they say, we will willingly give you tribute. So Menahem is left on the throne. And what we can tell, best we can tell anyway, Menahem stays loyal to Assyria so long as he's on the throne. His son Pekahiah comes to the throne, and he's probably loyal to Assyria as well. But what does Assyria think when the loyal kings, Menahem and Pekahiah, are then deposed? And now you've got an upstart on the throne in Israel. You've got Pekah on the throne of Israel. He's probably not too loyal. And we'll talk about this more on Sunday because this has a heavy influence on what happens in the kingdom of Judah in the reign of Ahaz. But what we read next in verse 29, in the days of Pekah, king of Israel, Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, came and captured Eon and Abel, Beth-Maholah, and Genoa, and Kadesh, and Hazor, and Gilead, and Galilee, all the land of Naphtali, and he carried them captive to Assyria. I should have put a map of Israel. Basically, what you're looking at is Assyria came, took most of Transjordan, or the eastern side of the Jordan River, because that's where some pretty significant trade routes would go through, and then also takes away really most of the northern part of Israel going into that hill country where Ephraim is located. So Israel is left with a rump of a kingdom now. The rest has been taken over by Assyria. Probably what happens in connection with that, when we read about Hoshea killing Pekah, Hoshea is a loyalist to Assyria. This is probably by Assyria's granting. We don't want Pekah on the throne anymore because he's not loyal to us. So this other Israelite, he comes to the throne. He'll be loyal to us. He'll pay the tribute. But as we're going to see, what happens when he doesn't pay the tribute? Israel's not going to exist anymore. Yes. And Egypt, by the way, we'll talk about that too. Egypt is just the, oh boy, what's a good way to put it? No, I can't say that. They are the illusion of power. That's an okay way to put it. They make a lot of promises, just put it that way. They make a lot of promises they cannot fulfill. Egypt is weak. But they keep on saying to nations like Judah and like Israel, you guys rebel. You guys, stand firm and we'll come and help you. And they rarely come and help, but they kind of provide a little bit of a buffer area between Egypt and Assyria, and that's all Egypt wants. So Egypt doesn't have a whole lot to offer. Okay, that's 2 Kings 15. I want to go to Hosea here in just a second, but any comments or questions on 2 Kings 15 and the rules of these five, or the reigns of these 5 kings? We're going to go back to Judah on Sunday, and then here in just a little while we'll come to the conclusion of the kingdom of Israel. Make sure there was nothing else I wanted to say there too. Okay, well, we've already seen this because the text already made it clear. All this is happening because of the continued wickedness and unfaithfulness of God's people. We talked about Amos and Hosea in our class on Sunday. Hosea prophesies beginning in the reign of Jeroboam II, so when things are really well in Israel. But he prophesies all the way until the end, all the way until Israel is conquered by the Assyrians. Hosea 13 is a passage that it would seem that perhaps this final conquest has not happened yet, but you can tell it's coming. It's not going to be too much longer. And so this is God's word to them. And I'll start reading in verse 1, and we can point out a few things in this passage. When Ephraim spoke, there was trembling. And so Ephraim standing oftentimes for all of Israel because it was kind of the dominant tribe. So Ephraim spoke, there was trembling. He exalted himself in Israel. But through Baal, he did wrong and died. So the idea, he gave his affections, he gave his allegiance to someone other than Jehovah God. And now they sin more and more, and make for themselves molten images, idols skillfully made from their silver, all of them the work of craftsmen. They say to them, let the men who sacrifice kiss the calves. So even there may be an allusion to the calves that were at Dan and Bethel. Again, Jeroboam did not instill Baal worship. But when they began worshiping the golden calves, everything else followed from it. Therefore they will be like the morning cloud, like dew which soon disappears, like chaff which is blown away from the threshing floor, and like smoke from a chimney. You kind of already get that from just what we've seen tonight. All these rulers, the longest reign being 10 years. It's not a long reign for a king. These dynasties not lasting more than 12 years. Well, Israel itself is just going to be this very temporary, something that's disappearing very quickly. God continues, verse 4. Yet I have been the Lord your God since the land of Egypt. And you were not to know any God except me, for there is no Savior besides me. I cared for you in the wilderness, in the land of drought. As they had their pasture, they became satisfied, and being satisfied, their heart became proud. Therefore, they forgot me. So oftentimes in these prophets, God brings them back all the way back to really their beginning as a nation. I brought you out of Egypt. I took care of you. But what happens to this people as soon as they come into the land, and certainly even as we understand the Old Testament, before they got to the land? They forget God. We've seen, though, that God has in mind, okay, I've brought them into the land. I've given them their pasture. They got satisfied. They forgot me. We talked about this with Amos, the idea of the people being confident that the Lord is roaring like a lion, and the fact that he was roaring like a lion meant that their enemies were going to be defeated, and then God says, I'm roaring against you. And so here in Hosea as well. So I will be like a lion to them. Like a leopard, I will lie in wait by the wayside. I'll encounter them like a bear robbed of her cubs, and I will tear open their chest. There I will also devour them like a lioness, as a wild beast would tear them. We talked about how Menahem and the savagery that he exacted on his kinsmen to the south. Now God is saying, this kind of savagery is going to happen to you. This is the kind of judgment and punishment that's going to happen to you. Verse 9, perhaps I find the most compelling. It is your destruction, O Israel, that you are against me, against your help. And that's kind of the idea. Again, look at Israel's position on the map and think of what they are historically. They are a small kingdom. Even when Solomon and David extended the borders of Israel to their furthest extent, they would still not be considered a great empire. They're a small kingdom. And how are they able to achieve any of this? How are they able to keep Egypt away? How are they able to keep the Babylonians and the Assyrians away? God helps them. God said, you're against me. You're against your help. And that's why your destruction is coming. So while God is behind the movements of the empires, God is calling forth the Assyrians that are going to come and punish His people. You can also look at it just from the standpoint of, okay, if God is the one who's helping them, God is the one who's protecting them, then what follows when God is no longer helping them is just the natural consequence of God not being your help. You are then subject to what the nations can and will do to you. And that certainly happens with Israel. Okay, I did a whole lot of talking tonight. Yes, Ross, please.
I was just going to comment on, you said that verse 9 struck here, stuck out to you. Verse 6 stuck out to me, that as they had a pasture, they became satisfied, and then because they were satisfied, they became proud, and they forgot God. And also earlier we were talking about, how like on the outside Israel might have looked like they were doing good, and then they fell so hard. I think that's a pretty present danger for us today. We have quite a lot of pasture here, and it's really easy to get satisfied and then to get proud and then to forget God.
Excellent. If you didn't hear Ross, Ross was commenting on verse 6 and how we need to make modern application of that. Israel had received these good things from God, and when they received those good things, they became proud and they forgot God. And certainly, as we have received so many good things from God, the same thing could happen to us. Brother Steve?
Earlier I said Deuteronomy 32, it's Deuteronomy 28.
I knew that, but that's fine.
I know, but it bothered me. The nations are doing God's bidding. It's providential.
Yeah.
God has a purpose through his foresight using those things under his control. He accomplishes that purpose. It says in Isaiah, the 7th chapter and verse 20, that Assyria is my hired razor that I'm going to shave the nations with. In the 10th chapter, he says that they are his rod of anger and his staff of indignation. So they work for him. And then in Ezekiel 21, as he talks about the sword of Babylon that he's sharpening and is about to pull out of his sword and lay death and destruction on the southern kingdom, in chapter 29, he says, I gave Nebuchadnezzar Egypt as wages for he worked for me. These guys, and Cyrus would come along, but these guys are doing God's bidding and what he wants them to do to accomplish his purpose, which is, Zechariah would say, to take out the dross and leave the pure behind.
Yes, absolutely. And Brother Steve mentioned Isaiah chapter 7. And so as you prepare for Sunday, we're going to talk about the reigns of Jotham and Ahaz in Judah. And we will consider Isaiah chapter 7, because that occurs during the reign of Ahaz. Isaiah chapter 7, which most of us know from the prophecy of the virgin birth. And we'll see how that connects to that time in Judah's history. Okay. Thank you, everyone. The bell is going to ring here in just a minute, but I think we are done for the evening.